In Chapter 4, we are going to talk about the nature of capitalism. So in this chapter, what we're going to discuss is historical stages and implications of capitalism, key features of capitalism including competition, companies, profit, and property, two classical justifications of capitalism, fundamental criticisms of capitalism including inequality, poverty, and worker exploitation. We're going to talk about economic challenges, including the decline of manufacturing, outsourcing, and work attitudes. So the chapter is introduced by talking about the basic historical and conceptual categories that are presented for understanding the socio-economic framework within which businesses, transactions occurs, and moral issues arise. Moral problems related to the free enterprise system and capitalism are identified. How can capitalism increase wealth without creating moral issues? Does capitalism enhance societies or tarnish them? We're going to go over this throughout the chapter. So what is capitalism? So first of all, we have to know what capitalism is before we can talk about if it is morally right or if it's not right. So, capitalism is an economic system in which the major portion of production and distribution is in private hands, operating under what is termed a profit or market system. Socialism, in contrast, is the polar opposite of capitalism, an economic system characterized by public ownership of property and a planned economy. Worker control socialism. It's a hybrid, a mix between the market-oriented socialism. So let's go on to explore more about capitalism. So the history of capitalism is that it evolved from the Renaissance through several stages. It first started with mercantilism. Mercantile. Then it went into industrial, then financial, then state welfare capitalism. So first, in mercantile, they had a mutual dependence between state and commercial interests. The economic health of the nation depended on how much precious metal that you had. If you had a lot of gold, then you were considered a wealthy nation. Industrial capitalism is the large-scale industry. That is when there is mass production and also expanding markets. Then it went on to financial capitalism. And financial capitalism is when banking came to be, and also insurance. Finally, we have state welfare capitalism. That is when government plays an active role. That's where the government takes taxes out of your check because they want to have some welfare programs for people that don't have the means necessary to support themselves. So the government does step in and take money out of the checks of people that are working. Okay, so many believe that we are at a new stage of capitalism right now, called globalized capitalism. This involving the reliance upon foreign labor and services, joint ventures, and overseas companies, outsourcing, and etc. So right now that we have the option to outsource and get some products and services from other countries, then we can. And right now, it's becoming more globalized. Capitalism is constantly changing as new socioeconomic and political conditions arise. So now that different environmental factors such as technology and the political climate, laws been passed, that affects capitalism. And we're going to go on to discuss that in the next few slides. So the key aspect of capitalism is companies. Companies run capitalism. They are the basic need for capitalism. And capitalism permits the creation of companies or business organizations that exist separately from the people associated with them. So when you create your company, when you go and file the incorporation papers for your corporation, what that is doing is it is actually creating an artificial person. And we're going to talk about that in the next slide. The main motive for capitalism is to make some profit. The profit motive implies a critical assumption about human nature that human beings are economic creatures who recognize and are motivated by their own monetary interests. So what that means is that they're saying that every human being are motivated by making profit and making money for their self-interest. Some people agree with this and some people disagree. So when we talk about capitalism, a key feature in capitalism is competition. Competition in the infamous treatise of a political economy, an inquiry into the nature of causes of the wealth of nations, Adam Smith explained how free competition makes individual pursuits of self-interest socially beneficial. What he's saying is that when capitalism is at its finest and companies compete against each other for self-interest, then that benefits everybody because that makes the money flow, that makes the prices go down for the goods and services because the competitors are forcing you to make prices go down. So he says that competition in capitalism does benefit society. Private property is a concept that talks about capitalism requires private ownership of the major means of production. That means they have the right to owning factories, warehouses, offices, machines, trucks, land, and etc. So capitalism does need the right to private property. The natural right to property. One basic defense of capitalism rests on the supposed natural moral right to property. Okay, so we talked about utilitarians in the previous chapter, and they deny the existence of such rights. They think that utilitarians think that everybody should be happy and everybody should share money and everybody should have their own. Other critics doubt that this right entitles one to have a system of property rule and regulation identical to the one we now have in the USA. So Adam Smith came up with a concept of the invisible hand. In his Wealth of Nations, Smith argues that when people are free to pursue their own economic interests, they will, without intending it, produce the greatest good for all. So utilitarians believe that sharing the money equally is going to make everybody happy. Adam Smith defends capitalism by saying that if you are free to pursue your own economic interest, then that's going to be good for everybody because pure capitalism would be great for lowering prices and having everybody be happy. This argument rests on the premise that human beings are acquisitive and have a natural propensity for trading. So the argument also suggests that human beings have the natural instinct to trade. So more about the invisible hand concept is that the law of supply and demand. Smith argues that a market left to itself regulated by the mechanism of supply and demand. The high demand for certain types of goods in one area of the market will eventually offset supply in another area. The law of supply and demand is equally applicable to the standard of wages. So he's saying this invisible hand in pure capitalism it has a way to regulate itself. And there's people that argue that the government steps in too much on capitalism, which doesn't make it pure capitalism. So there's criticisms of capitalism. There's critics raise both theoretical and operational objections to capitalism. Some of their theoretical criticisms is they challenge capitalism's fundamental values, basic assumptions, or inherent economic tendencies. Then there's the operational criticisms. That it says capitalism focuses more on capitalism's failure to live up to its own economic ideals. So there's a lot of people that argue against capitalism, and these are some of the assumptions. A lot of the times, people blame capitalism for a bunch of the inequalities in the world today. Critics argue that poverty and inequality challenge the fairness of capitalism and its claim to advance the interests of all. So they're saying that capitalism separates people, it creates inequality. There's the rich, then there's the poor, and there's a lot more poor people than there are rich. And they say the rich use capitalism to get richer, and the poor struggle to catch up. But sometimes people defend capitalism and they say capitalism is good. They blame the government for interfering. If in pure capitalism, such as what Adam Smith was talking about, the way the supply and demand favors capitalism, and it regulates itself. If the government doesn't step in, then everything should be okay. But people that say capitalism causes all this inequality, the defenders of capitalism say, you know what? It's because the government steps in and it's not pure capitalism. By arguing that capitalist systems can be internally modified by political action. There's a lot of talk that politics cause a corruption of capitalism, and that's why it's not what it should be. By arguing that the benefits of the system outweighs its peak points. That's another argument. So human nature and capitalism. Capitalism wrongly assumes that human beings are rational economic maximizers. Capitalism offers us no higher sense of human purpose. Capitalism operates on the assumption that human beings find increased well-being through ever greater material consumption. A lot of people argue that capitalism makes people materialistic and that it makes people want to go buy more and more things and turns their thoughts into nothing but materialistic. Competition isn't what it's cracked up to be. People argue that competition breeds oligopolies, that competition really makes companies more rich. The rich get richer, and the companies just get bigger instead of having competition of all these small businesses. Corporate welfare programs offer shelter businesses from competition. So instead of competition being pure competition, which should increase innovation and should lower prices for consumers, they're saying that corporate welfare programs, where these the government helps corporations by supporting them with financial aid, that messes up capitalism. So competition isn't what it should be. Critics contend that cooperation rather than competition leads to better individual and group performance.